All right, before we plunge ahead into part two, I just wanted to go back and actually reread a couple of paragraphs that, to me, underscore the themes that I think help us contextualize and follow the through line through all of this into today's situation with Ukraine, which is we see the oligarchy, in this case embodied by the black nobility, allied with the Anglo-Americans, operating Synarchist networks against the sovereign nation state, which is animated by this principle of progress and development. And this is the essential conflict that has been going on for many centuries, going back to the time of Machiavelli, the actually even before then, the time of Dante Alighieri. We see this conflict. So, let me just reread this just a little bit, going back to part one. Going back to the Nazi occupation of northern Italy during World War II, however, to examine the various British, American, and Nazi actors and their respective ties to different Italian factions, the reality quickly becomes apparent that the Anglo-American Synarchists merely replaced and to a great extent subsumed the Nazis and Mussolini's fascists as the would-be fascist occupying power, locked in mortal struggle against those Italian patriots, both conservatives of the Christian democracy and the leftists of the Italian Communist Party, who wished to establish a sovereign Italy. The battle for a sovereign Italy centered on economic policy. In 1950, forces around wartime partisan leader, later industrialist Enrico Mattei, friend of John F. Kennedy, effected a radical shift within the ruling Christian democracy away from free market policies, which not really free market at all. It's the Adam Smith Invisible Hand version, the Wizard of Oz version, toward a dirigistic program of rapid industrial growth. And I think here we need to acknowledge, just briefly, the older, now forgotten American system of economics, which was articulated by Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry, what was his name? Not Henry Clay. Oh dear. Henry C. Carey. Who wrote a fascinating book contrasting the American system with British imperialism called The Harmony of Interests, in which I think he articulates this idea that we need to acknowledge just on a practical level that it is perhaps only the state that has the capacity to coordinate all the moving parts involved in rapid industrial growth and in rapid progress and kind of the accelerated evolution of a population can only be overseen by the state, which is dirigism. With an extraordinary series of state-sponsored corporations and projects such as the Cassa per il Mezzogiorno, Southern Italy Development Fund, based on the model of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority, Italy experienced an economic miracle with annual growth of over 7% for almost a decade. A linchpin of this was the newly founded National Oil Company, ENI, which Mattei headed in a war for energy independence against the Synarchists' seven sisters. Enraged at Italy's developing sovereignty, the Anglo-Americans deployed terrorism and assassinations to stop it. Borghese's activities run like a black dye through all of this history until he fled to Spain in 1970. Let us now examine the scene in which he was to be so prominent an actor. So now moving ahead with part two. Already during World War II, Allen Dulles and other Anglo-American Synarchists who had sponsored both Mussolini and Hitler in the first place were trying to negotiate a peace with the Nazis which would leave them in power, sans Hitler and a handful of others. This Nazi puppet regime would then ally with the British and the United States to conquer the Soviet Union, establishing a Synarchist world empire. Incredible. In light of the situation in Ukraine, in light of the kind of insane, delusional mobilization or what would you call it, quasi-mobilization that going on within NATO now, and this ridiculous posturing, we see the foundations of this being laid then. Dulles' negotiating partner, SS General Wolf, said that he wanted to, quote, to build a bridge to the west, unquote, which would entail handing northern Italy over to the Allied military forces, but with German troops remaining in place as, quote, part of the proposed police force of the Western powers against Russia. Amazing. That's exactly what we're seeing. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by contrast, wanted to crush the fascist regimes and foresaw a post-war world in which the colonial empires of all the European powers, starting with the British, would be abolished, and the United States and the Soviet Union, wartime allies, would cooperate in a grand program of global economic growth into which the rest of the world would be drawn as well. Dulles and his fellow Synarchists did not achieve their full scheme, but they did establish NATO as an occupation authority for Europe, which prepared for war against the Soviet Union. Lord Bertrand Russell's early 1946 call for preemptive nuclear warfare against the Soviet Union is typical. In the name of fighting communism, Europe would be kept under Anglo-American domination through NATO, and any and all means would be authorized toward that goal. Upon FDR's death in April 1945, the Synarchist puppet President Harry S. Truman adopted these quote-unquote anti-communist schemes, which led immediately to the Cold War. Of course, I think now we understand that it was not the left-behind units and were not actually directed at stopping the advance of the Soviet Union. They were directed at stopping nations in the region for pursuing independent economic policies and thus becoming sovereign, that is, independent of economic controls imposed from Geneva. When the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established in 1949, a secret clause in its treaty specified that each nation that wished to join must first establish a, quote, national security authority, unquote, to fight communism, including through the deployment of clandestine citizen cadres. This demand grew out of a secret committee set up by the British and the U.S. within the Atlantic Pact, the forerunner of NATO, Truman's National Security Council issued directives authorizing the armed forces to use military force against communist parties, which commanded strong popular support in several European countries as a result of the war, even if those parties gained participation in government through elections. For this purpose, NATO and the Anglo-American intelligence services set up, quote, stay-behind units in all European countries. According to Italian General Paolo Inserilli, who commanded Italy's Gladio unit from 1974 to 86, the Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC, and its allied Clandestine Committee, ACC, were the, quote, interface between NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, and the secret services of the member states as far as the problems of non-orthodox warfare were concerned, unquote. The CPC, said Inserilli, was dominated by an inner executive group of the United States, Britain, and France, while the ACC was essentially a technical committee to coordinate expertise in explosives, repression, or related problems of clandestine warfare. Italian General Gerardo Serravalle testified that the members of the CPC were the officers responsible for the stay-behind apparatus in the various European countries and that, quote, at the stay-behind meetings, representatives of the CIA were always present, as well as, quote, members of the U.S. Forces Europe Command, unquote. The mid-1970s U.S. Congressional Investigative Committee under Senator Frank Church, which examined illicit actions by U.S. intelligence services and the military, found that the Pentagon had requested the CIA's covert branch, the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, to take the point in establishing stay-behind armies in Europe. The early plans were focused on the Soviet Union, as the Church report noted, quote, until 1950, OPC's paramilitary activities, also referred to as preventive action, were limited to plans and preparations for stay-behind nets in the event of a future war. Requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these projected OPC operations focused on Western Europe and were designed to support NATO forces against Soviet attack, unquote. However, the Pentagon soon went much further. A Joint Chiefs of Staff directive of May 14, 1952, set up Operation Demagnetize, in which the CIA and the military secret services were instructed to reduce the magnetic attraction of the large communist parties of Italy and France through all means, including, quote, political, paramilitary, and psychological operations, unquote. The directive stated, quote, the limitation of the strength of the communists in Italy and France is a top priority objective. This objective has to be reached by the employment of all means. The Italian and French government may know nothing of the plan Demagnetize, for it is clear that the plan can interfere with their respective national sovereignty. Of course, that's the whole point in reality. Operationally, the stay-behind units were run by the military secret services of each NATO nation as directed by the CPC-ACC. Some light was shed on Pentagon and NATO thinking of this time in a Pentagon field manual found along with lists of members of the elite Propaganda 2 P2 Freemasonic Lodge in P2 Grandmaster Licio Gelli's villa in Arezzo, Tuscany in 1981. Although issued in 1970, Field Manual 3031B, FM 3031B, reflected earlier Pentagon and NATO planning. It emphasized that military and other Secret Service leaders in each country should be recruited as U.S. or NATO agents. Quote, the success of internal stabilization operations, which are promoted in the context of strategies for internal defense by the U.S. military Secret Service, depends to a large extent on the understanding between the U.S. personnel and the personnel of the host country. The recruitment of senior members of the Secret Service of the host country as longtime agents is thus especially important, unquote. This process began already in 1944-45, when the Anglo-American Synarchists reconstructed Italy's military secret service and its military police, the Carabinieri, which will be a whole topic for the next mini-series, suggested by a very brilliant comment in the comment section of our last video. Great subject. Very logical step. Some of the key individuals whom they installed or sponsored later turned up as members of P2, from where they oversaw the terrorism and assassinations of the late 1960s and 1970s, as well as the cover-ups. Like Borghese, some of the leaders had been recruited by Angleton himself. One of them was Federico Umberto D'Amato, chief of the UAR, a secret section of the Interior Ministry which coordinated the terrorist actions under NATO direction in conjunction with the military secret services. Furthermore, stated the FM 3031B, quote, there may be times when host country governments show passivity or indecision in the face of communist subversion and, according to the interpretation of the U.S. Secret Services, do not react with sufficient effectiveness. Most often, such situations come about when the revolutionaries temporarily renounce the use of force and thus hope to gain an advantage, as the leaders of the host country wrongly consider the situation to be secure. U.S. Army intelligence must have the means of launching special operations which will convince host country governments and public opinion of the reality of the insurgent danger, unquote. Wow. FM 3031B was issued in 1970. Coup attempts against the Italian government under precisely the circumstances it describes were launched using Gladio personnel, including Borghese, that year and 3 times more through 1974. The manual stressed, quote, these special operations must remain strictly secret. Only those persons who are acting against the revolutionary uprising shall know of the involvement of the U.S. Army in the internal affairs of an allied country. In fact, that the involvement of forces of the U.S. military goes deeper shall not become known under any circumstances, unquote. The British role. As in virtually everything to do with imperial strategies, the relevant U.S. circles were being carefully guided by their senior partners, the British, under the old rubric, British brains and American brawn. And again, as maybe some of you know, I have no patience for people who believe that the Americans took up the torch for global imperialism and that the Brits resigned themselves to, tag-along status. I believe that the British are still in a leadership position and that the U.S. military is basically under British control. That's my position, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, moving on. Gladio was modeled on the actions of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, behind enemy lines during World War II, which had been created by the British Ministry of Defense, MOD, in 1940 under orders from Churchill to, quote, set Europe ablaze. That rings all kinds of bells now, doesn't it? In terms of the domestic situation in the United States and in many places in Europe, particularly France now. In charge of the SOE was Minister of Economic Warfare Hugh Dalton, who said, "We have to organize movements in enemy-occupied territory comparable to the Sinn Féin movement in Ireland, to the Chinese guerrillas now operating against Japan, to the Spanish irregulars who played a notable part in Wellington's campaign, or, one might as well admit it, to the organizations which the Nazis themselves have developed so remarkably in almost every country in the world." If you're looking at the text now, you see emphasis added, and I would recommend, for clarification on that and a little more context, to go back and listen to, that was a couple of videos ago on the Nazi International. Makes a lot of this very clear. The SOE was closed down at war's end and replaced by the Special Air Services, SAS, which helped Britain's Foreign Secret Service, MI6, to train the stay-behind armies of Europe. And I think SAS is, still today the preeminent special forces and basically the model upon which all special forces have been subsequently created, as I understand it. Gladio specialist Daniela Ganser for the Center for Security Studies at Zurich Technical University observed, "Many within the stay-behind community regarded the British to be the best in the field of secret warfare, more experienced than the military officers of the U.S." Unquote. The British set up a base for training stay-behind units at Fort Monkton outside Portsmouth, England, and another in Sardinia. One of the stay-behind operatives trained at Fort Monkton recalled, "We were made to do exercises, going out in the dead of night and pretending to blow up trains in the railway stations without the station master or the porters seeing you. We crept about and pretended to lay charges on the right part of the railway engine with a view to blowing it up." Unquote. In the Gladio coordinated blind terror, which ravaged Italy from 1969 through 1980, trains and railway stations were to be a favorite target, notably the 1974 bombing of the Rome-Munich Italicus Express, which killed 12 and injured 48, and the explosion in the Bologna rail station in August 1980, which killed 85 and seriously injured or maimed 200. Lyndon LaRouche first emphasized within hours of the Madrid train bombings of March 11, 2001, which killed 200 and wounded thousands more, that they were not the work of Islamic terrorists, but followed the pattern of the 1980 Bologna bombing. Okay, so obviously parallels with 9/11 there. Vincenzo Vinciguerra, an Italian neo-fascist terrorist who was jailed for life and who had been bitter about the Secret Service's manipulation of neo-fascist groups ever since 1945, explained how Gladio and any sister organizations worked. Quote, "You had to attack civilians, the people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people far removed from any political game. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. This is the political logic that lies behind all the massacres and bombings which remain unpunished, because the state cannot convict itself or declare itself responsible for what happened." Unquote. After Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti exposed the existence of Gladio in 1990, the BBC's news edition undertook its own examination of Gladio. It reported in April 1991, quote, "Britain's role in setting up stay-behinds throughout Europe was absolutely fundamental." Those familiar with the BBC's rhetoric, you will see in the word fundamental that kind of amoral, meaningless buzz phrase that isn't calculated to like hook the average citizen into believing that this was a security necessity. Typical, isn't it? Fundamental. More crucial than the stay-behinds were the secretive bodies which coordinated them, such as P2. Here, too, the British led the way. Already in 1944-45, the British set up a proto-P2 Masonic lodge composed of House of Savoy monarchists, aristocrats, and Mussolini loyalists. A January 2nd, 1945 OSS report noted, "The lodge is under British authority and will request their political and economic aid, things which the members cannot get through their respective parties without exposing themselves to accusations of being paid by the British." And at least as far as I understand, the P2 Propaganda Due Lodge was a vast and incredibly powerful organization, but it was set up under the direction of the Duke of Kent. So I think we'll let it go there. We'll jump in next time with NATO's Italian theater. So thanks very much for going along with the ride. Appreciate all comments, encouraging comments and questions. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you.